So we did our project on nihilism, individualism, and addiction within the Pale King. So just a little background about the text. The Pale King was written by David Foster Wallace during the last years of his life. During these years, he spent time taking accounting courses in order to fully understand the field so that he could write this novel. At the time of his death in 2008, he had not completely finished writing the text. However, he left a series of different novellas on a desk in his home to be sorted through. Two editors who had known him for many years came together to organize these pieces from the Pale King using only a few broad notes that they were left. This was an extremely difficult task because many of the stories seemed to be very interconnected, while others seemed more self-contained. After a few years of work, the editors were able to form the novel that we know today. So this YouTube video is an interview with two of the editors of The Pale King who had known Wallace for many years before his death. It explains some of the background behind the forming of the novel, as well as a common theme of focusing on the boring parts of life in order to understand the complexity of the human life as a whole.
What David left behind was nearly 3,000 pages of drafts in various forms. Some of them were handwritten, some of them were neatly typed, some of them were on computer disks. They were tucked away in various folders. They were spread all through his office. It was this massive material.
Just a pile of things, and in no particular order, just like puzzle pieces.
It was a puzzle piece. Within the book, there were repeated references to tornadoes, and in notes he'd written to himself to a tornadic structure that suggested that he wanted this book to be kind of a whirling, high wind, massive material coming at the reader that way. So those were some of the guidelines that I followed.
Besides that manuscript, David Foster Wallace left a typed note, and he laid out the premise of The Pale King, and this is what he writes. He says, "Bliss, a second-by-second joy and gratitude at the gift of being alive, conscious, lies on the other side of crushing boredom." Michael Peach, what was he getting at here?
The book attempts the greatest challenge I've ever seen a novelist take on, which is to write a novel about the boring parts of life. Every other novelist in history is compressed around the exciting part.
Right.
Elmore Leonard famously said he became successful when he learned to leave out the parts that people skip. David's goal from the very start was to make people look at the parts they usually skip. There's a chapter written by a character named David Foster Wallace, and he begins by saying, go back and read that fine print on the copyright page of the book. His goal was to make people look at the parts of life that they don't usually focus on and understand that this is where life is really happening.
I mean, he has scenes where he's talking about characters auditing tax returns.
He has characters auditing tax returns. He has characters having long conversations when stuck in an elevator that stopped between floors. He very amusingly sets scenes in these sort of agonizing circumstances, but he makes them riveting. He makes them brilliant. He makes them glorious, and he shows to get outside of ourselves and to actually connect with another person, you have to navigate all the complexity of life, all the difficult, complicated details. By doing that, then you can get to joy and to love and to the meaning of life. So the book deals with boredom, but it's because it wants to deal with joy.
So the summary of Chris Fogel. Chris Fogel was the main character of this novella and is depicted as a nihilist during his youth. He can be seen as a nihilist due to having a lack of motivation and initiative, as his father mentions. Also, before he joins the IRS, he proudly identifies as a nonconformist, meaning his views and behavior are different than those in his environment. Lastly, we see his nihilistic behavior through his use of drugs to combat against the personal struggles, such as school and finding his life's purpose. As the novella continues, we see a shift in the protagonist's behavior following the death of his father. This shift is partly due to this traumatic experience when his father dies in a public transit accident. After this happens, Chris begins to take initiative and strives to find purpose in his life. So the shift from nihilism to purpose. Throughout Chris Fogel's youth, he felt as if he was a wasteoid and nothing in his life had any meaning. A quote from page 154, "I think the truth is that I was the worst kind of nihilist, the kind who isn't even aware he's a nihilist. I was like a piece of paper on the street in the wind, thinking, now I think I'll blow this way. Now I think I'll blow that way. My essential response to everything was, whatever." As the novella continues, we see that Chris Fogel's father was killed in a tragic accident in 1977, which marks the initial turning point for his life. If this traumatic experience had never happened, he wouldn't have found purpose in his life through his time at the service. In the following year, 1978, Chris Fogel truly begins to find his direction in life, giving him purpose for the first time. A quote from page 172, "Things began to get much more vivid, focused, and concrete in 1978. And in retrospect, I suppose I agree with Mom and Joyce that this was the year I found myself, or put away childish things, and began the process of developing some initiative and direction in my life, which obviously led to my joining the service." So, due to his father's death, Fogel decided to re-enroll in college to take an accounting course in honor of his father. He ends up entering the wrong classroom, however. He is moved by the powerful presence of his professor and finds his calling. In the scholarly article, Accounting for Meaning, on subsection 22 of David Foster Wallace's The Pale King by Christopher Michelson, the author says, however, it's the longest section is a nearly 100-page first-person narrative of how one Chris Fogel found his calling in accounting, including an accidental encounter with his professor, who deemed it to be nothing less than heroic. He also says, in the parlance of the scholarly literature, as a result of the professor's speech, Fogel finds meaning in work that is a significant purpose, rendering a kind of moral justification for the accounting endeavor. What the author is getting at is saying that due to this professor's speech, he was moved and was able to find meaning in his work.
All right, so the theme of addiction kind of explains how Chris, how his mindset is, and kind of sets the tone for his experiences. So it starts with you could see that Chris had an addiction problem at a young age. He was frustrated easily, and so he has learning troubles. So he turned to Ritalin to help him with his learning troubles, and this sort of this kind of had him view the context of what he was reading instead of reading for the meaning. He was kind of counting the words on the page, and so this kind of shit like this positions himself for a kind of non-conformist attitude, as like he's not like everybody else. He reads the number of words on a page, and this factors into his lack of motivation and initiative. And so we go into marijuana, which we believe enables his nihilism. And so for him, his association with marijuana is that he spaces out and he's kind of unproductive. And on page 180, he explains this. The truth is that I actually prefer to smoke pot by myself. I was much more comfortable with pot if I could be high by myself and just sort of space out. And then he continues to connect it to his self-esteem and said for him, although I like pot, for me, although I like pot in some situations, the problem was more specific. Smoking pot made me self-conscious, sometimes so much so that it made it difficult to be around people. And this is on page 181. And this is completely different from Albatross. Okay, can we get the next slide? This is completely different from his addiction to Albatross, which countered his nihilism. So unlike his normal nihilistic, purposeless mindset, Albatross confirmed his presence. So he kind of shows this on page 181 when he says, my affinity for Albatross has to do with self-awareness. He then makes this crazy comparison to a machine that realizes it is human. And he says this on page 182, as though I was a machine that suddenly realized it was a human being and didn't have to just go through the motions. It was programmed to perform over and over. It also had to do with paying attention. And so we can kind of see how Albatross sort of shifted his normal nihilistic mindset and into instead of him going through the motions of everyday life, he was more focused. He was more there in the moment. And he confirms this on page 183 when it says, the feeling of Albatross, that I was aware of the awareness, it maybe sounds abstract or stoned, but it isn't. To me, it felt alive. And so later on in the novel, he turns to counting numbers to solve his nihilistic struggles rather than the drugs. And so moving on to the theme of individualism, in neoliberalism and contemporary literature and culture, The quote is, "In distinction to such strictly materialist accounts, Lisa Dunnigan figures neoliberalism as a pro-business secular faith that manipulates our understanding of race, gender, sexuality, and religion in the interest of conservative politics and capital accumulation." Um, this kind of shows how Chris Vogel, how society influenced his decisions. For example, his parents, their divorce, he kind of, didn't have a family, and that kind of factored into his individualism, his kind of nonconformity, how he did everything by himself. Um, Even so, to the context of the novel, which was autofiction, it felt like he was really, it was kind of an autobiography, and sort of you see a shift from individualism to him referring to himself as a wasteoid to more of a responsible responsible adult, responsible individual after the death of his father, and that personality change allows him to become more motivated in life and find his purpose. And so finally, we can see kind of themes of politics, government, and civics. Uh, the social responsibility of corporations versus their drive for profit. On page 131, he talks about corporations are getting better and better at seducing us into thinking the way they think, of profits as the telos and responsibility as something to be enshrined in symbol and evaded in reality. He talks about individualism and how it contradicts social responsibility. So when he says there's something very interesting about civics and selfishness, and we get to ride the crest of it. Here in the U.S., we expect government and law to be our conscience, our superego, you could say. It has something to do with liberal individualism, something to do with capitalism, but I don't understand much of the theoretical aspect. What I see is what I live in. And he also says we don't think of ourselves as citizens, parts of something larger to which we have profound responsibilities. We think of ourselves as citizens when it comes to our rights and privileges, but not our responsibilities.
So my thesis was, throughout the novella, Chris Vogel finds himself as being a wasteoid throughout youth, not finding meaning through anything until he attends the wrong class during his re-enrollment. Through his shift from nihilism to purpose, Chris Vogel functions as a symbol for college students waiting for that one course where they find their purpose and meaning in life.
All right, so my thesis is Chris Vogel, through his retrospective lens, explores the meaning of social responsibility and the balance between it and the new era of capitalism. Chris Vogel represents the concerns and priorities of the 2020 voter.
And finally, my thesis is, without the traumatic death of Chris Vogel's father, he would not have ever found his purpose in life or his accounting career.